He was not howling at the storm. He was calling someone back from it. Before the first rescue truck reached the ridge, before the sheriff's lights painted the snow red and blue, before anyone understood why a German shepherd would stand alone on the edge of a frozen cliff and cry into the white emptiness, Staff Sergeant Caleb Turner had already stopped walking. The sound had found him first. It came through the wind like a broken hymn, thin at first, then rising, long and mournful, rolling over the pine trees and down into the narrow mountain road below. Caleb stood beside his old green pickup, one gloved hand resting on the open door, his breath turning silver in the air. It was just past dawn outside Silverton, Colorado, and the whole world looked unfinished, buried under nearly 2 feet of fresh snow. The road behind him was empty. The road ahead disappeared into a pale curtain of blowing powder. Above him, jagged cliffs leaned over the valley, their dark stone shoulders frosted white, their edges softened by ice but still sharp enough to remind a man how small he was. Caleb had come home to the mountains for silence. That was what he told people. After 12 years in the Marine Corps, after too many nights listening for things no one else could hear, after leaving Camp Lejeune with a duffel bag, a stiff knee, and more memories than he knew where to put, he had wanted a place where the loudest sound was wind in the trees. But silence had a way of opening doors inside a man. And this morning, the mountain had given him something else. A dog's cry. Caleb narrowed his gray-blue eyes and looked up toward the ridge. He was 37, broad-shouldered, fair-skinned, with close-cropped brown hair mostly hidden beneath a wool cap. A pale scar curved near his left eyebrow, not dramatic, just enough to catch the morning light when he turned his head. His face had the calm, watchful stillness of someone trained to notice what others missed. Yet beneath that discipline lived a tiredness he rarely named. He had spent the last winter helping at a veterans' outdoor retreat 2 towns over, fixing fences, clearing trails, keeping busy with honest work. Busy was easier than healing. Busy did not ask questions in the dark. The howl came again. Longer. Lower. Caleb felt it in his ribs. Easy, he whispered, though no one stood beside him. He reached into the passenger seat and grabbed the coil of climbing rope he kept there, along with a thermal blanket and a small first aid pack. Old habits. Mountain habits. Marine habits. Never drive snowy roads without a way to help. He shut the truck door quietly and stepped off the road into the drifts. Snow swallowed his boots almost to the shin. The cold bit through his jeans, then through the old field jacket he wore over a flannel shirt. But Caleb moved with patient care, angling toward a narrow deer trail that wound up through the pines. Above, the dog stood visible, now only in pieces between the trees, a dark shape against the white cliff line. German shepherd. Large. Male, judging by the frame. Black and tan coat whipped by wind, ears high, tail stiff, body leaning toward the drop as if the whole animal were tethered to something invisible beyond the edge. He was not pacing. He was not lost. He was waiting. Caleb had seen that kind of waiting before, years ago, in a different place, under a sun that made metal too hot to touch. A dog named Atlas had once waited beside him in a field of dust, refusing water until Caleb stood up first. Atlas had been a military working dog, all nerve and loyalty, with eyes that seemed to read a man's fear before the man admitted it. Caleb had trusted that dog with his life, and sometimes, in the private hours before morning, he still heard the soft click of Atlas's paws on concrete floors that no longer existed. He pushed the memory down, not away, just lower, where it could walk with him without taking over. The trail steepened. Ice glazed the stones beneath the snow. Caleb planted each foot carefully, catching branches with one hand, the rope across his shoulder, the wind slapping his face until his eyes watered. The German shepherd saw him when he was still 30 yards away. The dog turned his head, amber eyes bright under a dusting of snow on his muzzle. For one suspended second, man and animal simply stared at each other across the white distance. No bark, no growl, just recognition of need. "Hey, boy," Caleb said softly. "I see you." The shepherd gave a strained whine and looked back toward the cliff, then down into the hidden space below. His front paws trembled near the rim. Caleb's stomach tightened. The edge was worse than it had looked from the road. Wind had carved the snow into a cornice, a fragile lip hanging beyond solid ground. One wrong step, and it could break away like glass. Caleb lowered himself slowly, keeping his weight back. "Don't move," he murmured. "Stay right there." The dog's collar came into view, blue nylon crusted with ice, a small metal tag tapping faintly against it. Caleb could not read the name yet. He was close enough now to see snow packed between the shepherd's toes, ice clinging to the fur along his chest, and the exhaustion in the way his body shook. But the dog would not leave the edge. He lifted his nose and howled again, not at Caleb, not at the sky, but into the ravine. This time, when the sound faded, Caleb heard something beneath it. Not the wind, not the creak of trees. A faint, uneven sound rising from below. Small, human maybe, or something living trying hard to remain so. Caleb's hand tightened around the rope. His pulse slowed the way it always did when fear became purpose. He glanced at the shepherd, and the dog looked back with desperate, trusting eyes, as if he had been waiting for the one person who would understand without being told. Caleb swallowed against the cold in his throat. "All right," he whispered. "Show me why you stayed." Caleb adjusted the rope across his shoulder and began the careful descent, each step a deliberate negotiation with the snow and ice that threatened to give way beneath his boots. Shadow stayed just above the ledge, amber eyes fixed on him, the slight tremor in the dog's legs matching the rhythm of his own pulse. The air was sharper now, the wind slicing through the valley, carrying with it the scent of pine and cold stone, mingling with the faint metallic tang of the morning. Every branch he passed jingled softly under the weight of snow, and every shift of loose rock or hidden ice made his heart thump against his ribs. Caleb's breath fogged in the air as he counted each step, listening to the small, consistent whines from Shadow, a sound that was pleading yet patient, a call that was not for help, but for guidance. As he descended further, he glimpsed movement below, subtle, indistinct in the grayish light filtered through the clouded sky. The snow, packed and unstable, made each step a negotiation of balance and trust. He remembered the last time he had been in a situation that demanded perfect attention: Afghanistan, the long desert stretches, the heat that cracked the earth, the dogs that moved without hesitation beside him. Every paw step calculated, every glance meaningful. Shadow barked once, sharp, short, drawing Caleb's eyes to a small depression where snow had been shifted recently. Something alive, definitely alive, must be there. His hand went to the harness strap on his jacket, tightening slightly, and he lowered his body into a crouch, scanning the white expanse for any sign. The wind pressed against him, bringing with it a cold sting to his cheeks, and he felt the quiet, steady pulse of the mountain beneath the snow, solid but deceiving, capable of giving way at any moment. Shadow began to move down carefully, paw by paw, guided by Caleb's soft murmurings, his voice low but steady, the sound carrying through the still air and somehow reaching the dog with clarity. Caleb thought about the hours of training he had given to Shadow, the months of trust built quietly over mornings spent on empty beaches and forest trails, the bond that had developed from mutual respect rather than commands. It was that bond that kept them alive now, each trusting the other to make the right choice, to be steady in the face of uncertainty. As they approached the small depression, Caleb could now see the form more clearly, a tiny shape huddled against the snow, barely moving, yet very much breathing. He knelt carefully beside it, the rope coiled nearby in case the snow shifted, and extended a gloved hand. Shadow's nose pressed close to the shape, sniffing, growling softly, a protective and confirming sound, not aggressive, but deliberate, as if letting Caleb know that this was the reason for the morning cries. The creature, a small fawn of a pup, had eyes wide open, amber flecked, unafraid yet vulnerable. Caleb gently scooped the pup into his arms, feeling the small weight of it, the quick, shivering breaths, the warmth that was almost imperceptible through the snow-slicked fur. Shadow leaned in, muzzle brushing the pup's side, and gave a soft whine, a sound of recognition and relief. Caleb whispered to Shadow, his words meant to calm and guide. "You see, boy, we have work to do." The dog barked softly, low and urgent, and Caleb nodded, understanding the unspoken plan. He adjusted the strap of the rope around his shoulder and began the careful climb back to solid ground, each step deliberate, measured, his eyes flicking between the trail, Shadow, and the small life in his arms. The wind carried faint sounds of distant birds, the gentle sigh of trees settling under snow, and the quiet rush of the valley below, a natural symphony that accentuated the fragile perfection of the moment. They reached the flatter snowpack, Caleb kneeling again to check the pup, making sure its breaths were steady, its tiny paws curled against its body. Shadow pressed closer, a silent sentinel, watching for any hazard, aware of every step Caleb took, ears twitching at each faint noise, muscles coiled, ready. Caleb allowed a small smile, the tension in his shoulders easing fractionally. The pup was safe, Shadow was steady, and for a moment, the mountain, the wind, and the snow seemed to hold their breath, honoring the quiet miracle that had just occurred. He murmured under his breath, words lost to the wind but filled with intent. "We are here, and you are safe." Shadow nuzzled the pup, tail flicking slowly, and Caleb felt a rare calm settle through him, a stillness that came only from knowing that trust, courage, and patience had aligned, that his careful movements and the dog's instinct had together preserved life on this cold, white morning. The name on the frozen tag was Shadow, and Caleb read it only after the wind eased long enough for the little metal circle to stop tapping against the blue nylon collar. Shadow. The word felt less like a name and more like a warning written by the mountain itself. Caleb kept the tiny pup tucked beneath his field jacket, close against the warmth of his chest, while the German shepherd stood beside him with his body angled toward the cliff, still watching the drop as if the first rescue had not been the whole story. The pup was alive, but barely awake, no bigger than a bundled scarf, its sable fur stiff with melted snow and its little nose searching blindly for warmth. Caleb rubbed gently along its side with 2 fingers, slow and steady, the way he had once been taught to calm frightened animals without crowding them. "You did good, Shadow," he said, his voice rough from the cold. "You brought me to him." But Shadow did not relax. His ears twitched toward the ravine again. His chest rose and fell in quick bursts. Then he stepped forward, stopped at the edge of safer ground, and released a low, broken whine that seemed to carry all the pain the morning had not yet revealed. Caleb followed the dog's gaze. Below the cornice, past the place where they had found the pup, the slope curved down toward a stand of blue spruce, their branches bent under snow like old men in prayer. Something there looked wrong. Not movement exactly. A shape. A strip of red caught against white, half covered, too straight to be a branch. Caleb narrowed his eyes. A leash, maybe, or a scarf. He felt the mountain grow quieter around him, as if every pine needle had turned to listen. He lowered the pup carefully into the thermal blanket, wrapping it tight and setting it against a shallow hollow shielded by a fallen log. Shadow moved instantly to stand over it, nose touching the blanket once, then lifting back toward the slope. "Stay with him," Caleb whispered. Shadow looked at him, and in that look Caleb saw not obedience, but a plea. "Not finished. Please." Caleb tied one end of the rope around the thick base of a pine and tested it twice with his full weight. The bark creaked under his gloves. The rope held. He looped the other end around his waist, tightened the knot, and began easing sideways along the ridge, away from the fragile lip and toward a lower break in the slope. The snow came up to his knees in places. Every step had to be felt before it was trusted. Beneath the white powder were hidden rocks, pockets of ice, old roots slick as glass. The cold found the old injury in his knee and settled there, deep and stubborn, but Caleb kept moving. The shape below sharpened as he descended. It was not a scarf. It was a child's red knit hat, caught on the broken branch of a spruce. Caleb stopped breathing for half a second. Then the faint sound came again, a soft cry, thin and distant, not much louder than a kitten under a porch. Caleb turned toward it, heart steadying into purpose. "I hear you," he called, keeping his voice calm. "My name is Caleb. I am coming down." The answer was not words, only a small trembling sound from somewhere behind the trees. Shadow barked above him, one clear bark, and Caleb glanced back. The shepherd had not left the pup, but his whole body was pointed downhill, every part of him aiming Caleb toward the hidden voice. Caleb pushed through the spruce branches, snow spilling cold down the back of his collar. The scent changed there under the trees. Less wind, more pine sap, damp wool, fear. In the hollow behind a boulder, tucked where the slope flattened into a narrow shelf, He found a little girl sitting curled beneath a silver emergency blanket that had snagged around her shoulders. She could not have been more than 8 years old. Her cheeks were pale from the cold, her eyelashes dotted with ice, but her eyes were open, wide and blue, fixed on Caleb as if she were afraid he might disappear if she blinked. Beside her lay a small plastic sled, half buried, one rope handle trailing through the snow. Caleb crouched several feet away first, slow enough not to startle her. "Hey there," he said gently. "You are safe now. What is your name?" Her lips moved once before sound came out. "Emily." Caleb nodded like that was the bravest answer he had ever heard. "Emily, I found your dog." At that, her eyes filled with tears, but she did not sob. She only looked past him, toward the ridge. Shadow stayed. Caleb felt something inside his chest tighten and soften at the same time. "He stayed," he said. "He stayed the whole time." Emily closed her eyes, and the smallest smile touched her face, fragile as sunlight through storm clouds. Caleb checked her hands, her breathing, her voice, asking simple questions, keeping her awake, keeping the fear from growing too large. She told him in broken pieces that she had followed Shadow after he ran from the family cabin before sunrise, barking toward the trees. She had brought the pup in a basket because it would not stop crying. The sled had slipped near the ridge. Shadow had pulled the basket free before it slid too far, then climbed back and howled until someone heard. Caleb looked up through the branches toward the dark shape of the German shepherd above, standing guard over the wrapped pup in the snow. The reason for the howl was no longer a mystery. It was love, divided in two directions, refusing to abandon either one. Caleb lifted the radio from his jacket and called for help, giving the sheriff's dispatcher his location in a voice so steady it surprised even him. When he finished, Emily whispered, "Is Shadow in trouble?" Caleb shook his head and took off one glove, letting her hold his warm fingers in her cold hand. "No, ma'am," he said softly. "Shadow is the reason everyone is going home today." The dispatcher's voice faded into static, then returned in broken pieces, soft and distant beneath the wind. Caleb pressed the radio closer to his ear, shielding it with his shoulder, while Emily held on to his bare fingers like they were the last warm thing left in the world. Help was coming, but help in the mountains was never instant. The nearest road was below them, the trail was buried, and the storm had turned the ridge into a white maze where sound bent strangely and distance lied. Caleb looked at Emily's face, at the pale blue of her lips, at the way she fought to keep her eyes open, and he felt the old Marine part of him step forward inside his chest. Not panic, not fear, just the quiet, clean shape of duty. "Emily," he said gently, "I need you to keep talking to me. Can you do that?" She nodded a little. "About what?" "Anything warm." Her brows pulled together in confusion, then she whispered, "My mom makes cinnamon pancakes." Caleb smiled, though the cold had begun to stiffen his jaw. That is a good place to start. Above them, Shadow barked twice, and the sound rolled down through the spruce branches. Caleb looked up and saw the dog's dark shape shift at the ridge. The German shepherd was still guarding the wrapped pup, still watching Caleb, still holding two worlds together with nothing but instinct and love. Caleb tugged the rope once to check the anchor, then scanned the slope between him and the ridge. Going straight back up with Emily would be risky. The snow over the cliff edge was too soft, and she was too tired to help climb. Staying where they were carried its own danger. The hollow blocked the wind, but the cold gathered there like water in a bowl. Caleb needed shelter. Not perfect shelter, just enough to steal time. He remembered a ranger cabin somewhere east of the ridge, maybe half a mile away, used in summer by trail crews and locked most of the year. He had passed it once in October, when the aspens were gold and the ground smelled of wet leaves. Half a mile in deep snow might as well have been 5 miles with a child and a freezing pup, but the cabin had walls. Walls mattered. Heat could be made. Time could be bought. Caleb unclipped a small emergency whistle from his pack and placed it in Emily's mitten. "Hold this. If you feel sleepy, squeeze it. If you get scared, squeeze it. If you just want to make noise, squeeze it." Emily's fingers closed around it. "Will Shadow come?" Caleb glanced up. The dog had already understood movement before Caleb made it. He appeared at the top of the lower slope a moment later, descending carefully with the thermal blanket bundle held in his mouth by one folded corner, so gentle that the pup inside barely stirred. Caleb stared for a second, almost unable to speak. Snow clung to Shadow's whiskers. His paws slipped once, then found purchase. He carried that small life with the careful dignity of a soldier carrying a flag. When he reached Caleb, he set the bundle at Emily's feet and pressed his nose into her sleeve. Emily made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a cry. "Good boy," she whispered. Shadow leaned into her for one heartbeat, then looked back. At Caleb. "Ready." Caleb wrapped the pup more securely, tucked the bundle inside his jacket again, then lifted Emily with careful strength, keeping her emergency blanket around her shoulders. She was light, too light against the weight of the snow and the mountain and the morning. Shadow moved ahead, breaking the trail through the drifts, stopping every few steps to look back. Caleb followed the dog's tracks because Shadow chose the safest line, weaving between trees, avoiding hollow patches, ears flicking at sounds too subtle for human hearing. The wind pushed through the pines with a low organ note. Snow dust fell from branches in soft bursts. Emily's head rested against Caleb's shoulder, and he kept her awake with questions. Favorite ice cream? Favorite school subject? Favorite Christmas song? She answered slowly, sometimes with only one word, but each answer was a small candle in the cold. Chocolate. Science. Silent Night. That last one made Caleb pause inside himself. His mother used to hum that song in a kitchen in North Carolina when he was a boy, back before uniforms, before deployments, before he learned that grown men could carry invisible weather. He looked down at Emily and said, "That is a good song for a morning like this." She whispered, "Shadow likes it too." Ahead, the dog stopped suddenly. His body went stiff, not with fear, but with focus. Caleb halted at once. 10 feet in front of Shadow, the snow looked smooth and untouched, but the dog lowered his nose and backed away, whining under his breath. Caleb shifted Emily higher in his arms and studied the surface. A narrow drainage cut, hidden beneath powder. One step into it could trap a leg, or worse, spill them sideways down the slope. Shadow had found what Caleb could not see. "Good catch," Caleb said quietly. The dog turned left, leading them around the danger in a wide curve. Minutes stretched. The cold deepened. The pup stirred beneath Caleb's jacket, a tiny movement against his ribs, and that small sign of life kept him moving when his knee began to burn. Finally, through the trees, a dark square appeared. The ranger cabin sat half buried in snow, its roof white, its windows rimmed with frost, its old wooden door hanging slightly crooked but still there. Caleb felt relief rise so suddenly it almost hurt. Shadow reached the porch first, pawed at the door, then looked back. Caleb climbed the steps slowly, set Emily down just long enough to brace her against the wall, and pushed his shoulder into the door. The old latch gave with a tired groan. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, cedar, and cold ash. It was dark, but it was still. It was shelter. Caleb carried Emily in, laid her gently on the narrow cot, and placed the wrapped pup against her side. Shadow climbed up beside them without being asked, curling his warm body around both child and pup like a living wall against the winter. Caleb found a stack of dry kindling in a metal box near the stove, and when the first small flame caught, orange light trembled across the cabin walls. Emily watched it with heavy eyes. "Mr. Caleb," she whispered, "did God send you?" Caleb looked at Shadow, at the pup breathing beneath the blanket, at the snowstorm pressing its white hands against the window, and for a moment he did not trust his voice. Then he knelt by the stove and fed another stick into the flame. "Maybe," he said softly, "but I think he sent Shadow first." The fire did not roar at first. It whispered. A thin orange tongue caught the kindling, leaned into the dry cedar, and slowly became brave enough to push back against the cold that had owned the cabin for months. Caleb crouched in front of the iron stove with his hands held close to the warmth, feeling the sting return to his fingers. Pain was a good sign. Pain meant blood was moving. Behind him, Emily lay on the cot wrapped in the silver blanket and his spare wool liner, her red hat drying on a chair near the stove. Shadow stayed curled beside her, his body forming a dark crescent around both the child and the tiny pup, who now breathed in small, fluttering waves beneath the blanket. Every few seconds Shadow lifted his head, checked Caleb, checked the door, checked Emily, then lowered his muzzle again with quiet purpose. The dog had not been trained by Caleb. Caleb knew that now. Shadow belonged to this mountain, to this girl, to whatever. Family was somewhere below, afraid and searching. But there was discipline in him that felt familiar. The way he watched the room. The way he listened before moving. The way he made decisions without noise. Caleb had known Marines like that. He had known one dog like that. Atlas. The name came into his mind with the softness of a footstep in an empty hallway. For a moment the cabin changed around him. The cedar smell became dust. The stove's metal tick became the cooling engine of a convoy truck. Shadow's steady breathing became Atlas sleeping by a cot in a desert outpost. One ear always open, one paw always touching Caleb's boot. Caleb closed his eyes briefly and let the memory pass through without fighting it. Some grief only asks to be acknowledged. It does not always ask to be healed. The radio crackled again from his jacket pocket. Caleb pulled it free. This is Turner. I have the child and 2 dogs in shelter at the old North Ridge Ranger cabin. Child is awake, cold, and responsive. Pup is weak, but breathing. Adult German Shepherd is alert. Static answered him first. Then the dispatcher came through, faint but clearer than before. Copy that, Staff Sergeant Turner. Rescue team is moving from County Road 7. Visibility is low. Estimated access uncertain. Continue warming measures. Can you confirm the child's full name? Caleb turned toward the cot. Emily, he said softly. What is your last name, sweetheart? Her eyes opened halfway. For a second, she seemed to search the room for where she was. Then she whispered, Hartwell. Caleb repeated it into the radio. The dispatcher paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. It carried relief, but also the weight of hours. Confirmed. Emily Hartwell, age 8. Parents are at the lower command point. They have been searching since sunrise. Emily heard enough to understand. Her chin trembled. Mom is mad. Caleb moved to the cot and knelt beside her. Shadow raised his head, but did not move away. No, ma'am, Caleb said. Your mom is scared because she loves you. Those are different things. Emily blinked slowly, thinking that over in the tired way children do when they are trying to be brave. I was not trying to run away. I know. Shadow heard the puppy crying. He kept scratching at the cabin door. Dad said wait until daylight, but Shadow pushed through when I opened it. I thought I could just bring the puppy back. Caleb looked at the tiny bundle. You were trying to help. Emily nodded, tears sliding silently toward her ears. Then the sled went too fast. Caleb rested a hand gently over the blanket near her shoulder, careful not to crowd her. You made it to the trees. That was smart. Shadow pulled the basket. Her voice broke. He kept going back and forth. He stayed with me, then went to the puppy, then came back to me. I told him to get help. Caleb looked at the German Shepherd. Shadow's amber eyes met his in the firelight, steady and deep, reflecting flame as if he carried it inside him. And he did, Caleb said. He got help. Outside, the storm pressed against the cabin walls with a low, patient moan. Snow tapped the window like small fingers. Caleb added another split log to the stove, then searched the shelves. He found an old tin cup, a half-used box of matches, a dented kettle, and 3 sealed bottles of water left by some thoughtful ranger months ago. He poured a little water into the kettle and set it on the stove, then checked Emily's hands again. Warmer. Not warm enough, but better. The pup stirred when Shadow nudged the blanket open with his nose. Its tiny mouth parted in a weak squeak. Emily smiled through tears. His name is Finn. Caleb laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because the name made the small life in the blanket feel suddenly whole. Finn is a strong name. Emily whispered. He was the smallest. Shadow would not leave him behind. The words moved through Caleb with a quiet force. Would not leave him behind. That promise had followed him across oceans, through barracks, hospitals, airports, and lonely nights in rooms where the walls were too still. He had believed he failed that promise once. Atlas had grown old after service, slower in the hips, grayer around the muzzle, but still proud. Caleb had been away at a medical appointment when Atlas passed in the care of a friend, peaceful by all accounts, but alone from Caleb's point of view. That had been the thorn, not death itself, the loneliness of it. He had carried guilt like a stone, small enough to hide, heavy enough to shape every step. Shadow lowered his head onto Caleb's wrist, as if sensing the place the memory had opened. Caleb looked down. The dog did not ask for explanation. Dogs rarely do. They just arrive at the wound and stay there. The radio crackled once more. Turner, rescue team reports a blocked trail. They are working through, but it may take longer. Advise if condition changes. Caleb answered calmly. Understood. We are holding. But as he clipped the radio back to his jacket, Shadow suddenly lifted his head. His ears went forward, not toward the door, toward the back wall. Caleb followed his gaze to a narrow seam of darkness behind a stack of old firewood. At first, he saw nothing. Then came a sound. Soft. Scratching. Faint enough that a man could mistake it for wind. Shadow rose from the cot, careful not to disturb Emily or Finn, and stepped toward the sound with his nose low. Caleb stood slowly, every sense narrowing. The cabin, he realized, had one more secret beneath the storm. Shadow's ears twitched as he approached the narrow seam in the cabin wall, and Caleb followed closely, careful not to jostle Emily or Finn in his arms. The light from the small stove flickered over the rough wooden walls, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts across the floor. A faint scratching sound came again, soft but persistent, and Caleb crouched to peer into the darkness. There, partially hidden behind the stacked firewood, a tiny bundle of fur shivered, a second pup, barely bigger than Finn, with a thin layer of frost clinging to its coat. Shadow nudged the pup gently with his nose, coaxing it forward, while Caleb eased closer, adjusting the grip on Emily so she could watch without fear. Hello there, Caleb whispered. You are safe now. The pup responded with a tiny whimper and shifted closer to Shadow, who leaned down, ears forward, eyes steady, conveying reassurance with every movement. Caleb wrapped the new pup carefully in a spare thermal blanket, tucking it into Emily's lap alongside Finn. She blinked slowly, comprehension dawning in her gaze as she realized that Shadow had guided them not just to one small life, but to two, each equally fragile and precious. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, carrying the soft groan of the mountain and the rhythmic tapping of snow sliding from the roof. Caleb felt a pulse of gratitude for the warmth of the stove, the protection of the cabin, and the guidance of the dog who had done more than any map or compass could achieve. He knelt to make sure the pups were secure, smoothing the blankets over them, checking that Emily's small hands were tucked safely around the bundle. Shadow lay down beside the cot, his body a dark, protective line along the edge, eyes scanning the corners of the room, alert to every subtle sound. Caleb studied the dog, his amber gaze catching the flickering firelight, and for a moment he allowed himself to remember the long nights in the barracks, the fields of Afghanistan, the quiet hours before sunrise when the world seemed poised on the edge of danger. Shadow's presence brought that calm, the same certainty, the same trust that he had known in a partner on the battlefield, the unspoken assurance that survival could be guided by patience, instinct, and loyalty. He looked at Emily, then at the pups, then at Shadow, and the weight of the mountain, the storm, and the cold seemed to lift slightly, replaced by the quiet, potent knowledge of purpose. Caleb fed another stick into the stove, watching the flames rise, the small room glowing with a warmth that did not just touch skin but seeped into bones. Emily whispered the pups' names, Finn and Caleb smiled, brushing a lock of damp hair from her forehead. We can decide together, he said softly. The room fell into a comfortable rhythm. The fire popped and hissed, the wind outside sighed. Shadow's gentle breathing filled the quiet spaces, and the pups stirred lightly, safe and attended. Caleb took a deep breath, scanning the cabin for any hazards, making small adjustments to the blankets and stove placement, then returned to kneeling beside Emily, letting her hand rest in his. He spoke quietly, recounting calm stories of forest paths and snow-covered lakes, keeping her engaged, her attention steady. Shadow shifted occasionally, nudging the pups or placing his head on the edge of the cot, reminding all of them of his presence, the silent promise that they would not be left alone again. Caleb felt a sense of completeness, fragile but present, in the cabin filled with the warmth of fire, the trust of the dog, and the lives that now were safe under his care. The storm continued outside, but inside, life had found a small victory, guided by instinct, by care, and by the quiet, unwavering loyalty of Shadow. Caleb adjusted Emily's blanket again, making sure both Finn and the second pup were snug against her small frame, their tiny bodies rising and falling with fragile breaths. Shadow sat upright, ears forward, alert to every sound beyond the cabin walls, the faint howling of wind, the soft shift of snow on the roof, the creak of the old pine timbers. The cabin seemed to breathe with them, a hollowed heart against the cold that pressed from every side. Caleb took a deep breath and walked to the small table near the stove, pulling out a half-empty tin of emergency food, and placed it where Emily could reach if she wanted. Her fingers brushed against the metal, curious but hesitant. Caleb knelt beside her, gently guiding her hand to touch Finn's tiny head. "He is strong," Caleb said quietly. "He has Shadow to watch over him." Emily smiled faintly, eyes sparkling despite the frost lingering on her cheeks. Shadow gave a soft whine and nudged closer, pressing his side against the cot as if he understood every word, every unspoken promise. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the cabin, rattling the old shutters, but inside the warmth from the stove and the presence of Shadow created a bubble that seemed impervious to the storm. Caleb looked toward the window, noticing the way the morning light, pale and gray, sifted through the frost, painting the room in muted golds and blues. He considered the journey they had taken from the ridge, from the cliff, the care and patience it had taken to reach this point, the trust that Shadow had shown in every step, every glance. Caleb's mind drifted to the quiet moments in his own life, the long nights in distant barracks, the fields of early morning training, the moments when he had been called to protect, to guide, to trust instinct over certainty. Shadow embodied all of that now, a living lesson in courage and patience, teaching Caleb that the small acts of loyalty, the gentle guidance, the soft nudges, could matter more than orders, more than plans, more than words. Emily shifted slightly, murmuring, "He is like a hero." Caleb smiled softly. "Yes," he said, "he is a hero, and you helped him too." Shadow lifted his head, ears flicking toward Caleb, then returned his gaze to the pups, eyes bright, patient, steady. Caleb moved to the stove, adding another piece of kindling, the flames leaping higher, orange and alive, casting a soft glow over the wooden walls. He poured a small amount of water into the tin cup he had found and warmed it gently, testing it with his gloved hand before placing it near Emily's lips. She sipped carefully, eyes on Shadow, whose body seemed to thrum with calm energy, the living anchor between them and the uncertainty outside. Caleb leaned against the wall for a moment, listening to the room, the quiet breathing of the child, the pups, and the dog, the fire snapping, the wind outside hissing and moaning like it carried news of the mountain's patience. Shadow nudged Finn gently with his nose, pressing the pup closer to Emily's chest, then returned to stand near the door, body tense but unwavering, scanning every shadow for signs, listening to the wind and every subtle creak of the cabin as if it were a conversation he alone could understand. Caleb felt his shoulders relax fractionally, allowing a small exhale. The mountain, the storm, the cliff, and the descent had been dangerous, but they were here. The pups were alive. Emily was safe. Shadow had kept them together, and now the quiet moments in the warm cabin allowed for recovery, for reassurance, for the tiny miracle of presence and care to settle into their bones. Caleb crouched beside Emily once more, brushing a lock of damp hair from her forehead. "You are brave," he whispered. "And so is Shadow." Shadow's tail flicked slightly, brushing Caleb's hand, acknowledging the truth without a word. Outside, the storm continued to sculpt the world in white, but inside the cabin, life had been preserved, a fragile victory against the cold, the uncertainty, the hours that had stretched endlessly before dawn. Caleb sat back on his heels, hands resting lightly on his knees, eyes scanning the room, the firelight dancing across the walls, and allowed himself the briefest moment of gratitude for the dog who had guided them, for the warmth that sustained them, and for the quiet miracle of a morning survived together. The first sound of rescue did not come as a siren. It came as a distant hum beneath the wind, so low Caleb almost mistook it for the stove drawing air through the flue. Shadow heard it first. His head rose from beside the cot, ears pricked, body still as carved stone. Then his tail gave one careful sweep against the wooden floor. Caleb stood and moved to the frosted window, wiping a circle clear with the heel of his glove. At first there was only white, the storm thinning into pale sheets that drifted between the pines. Then, far below through a break in the trees, a blink of amber light moved slowly along the buried service road. Another followed. Rescue trucks. Caleb felt something in his chest loosen, not completely, but enough to let him breathe deeper than he had all morning. They are close, he said. Emily opened her eyes. She looked small beneath the layers of blankets, but the fear had faded from her face, replaced by tired hope. Finn and the second pup, now softly named Grace because Emily said she had waited quietly like a little prayer, slept tucked against her side. Shadow stepped to the door and gave a low whine, not anxious, just ready. Caleb lifted the radio. This is Turner at the North Ridge Ranger cabin. I have visual on lights below the east timber line. We are stable. Marking location now. The dispatcher answered through static, relief clear even across the broken signal. Copy, Turner. Team sees smoke from the cabin. They are coming up on foot. Parents are with county deputies at the trailhead. Emily's lips trembled at that. My mom is there. Yes, ma'am. Caleb said. Your mom and dad are waiting. She turned her face into Shadow's fur, and the dog lowered his chin gently over her shoulder, accepting the tears without moving. Caleb stepped outside for just a moment, carrying a bright orange panel from the emergency kit. The cold met him like a wall, but the storm had changed. The wind no longer screamed. It breathed. Snowflakes drifted in loose, tired spirals from a sky beginning to lighten over the ridge. He tied the orange panel to the porch rail, then stamped a clear path from the door to the edge of the clearing. Each sound felt sharper now, the creak of his boots, the soft thud of falling snow from pine branches, the distant voices calling through the timber. Human voices. Real voices. Cabin, someone shouted. We are here. Caleb lifted one arm. Over here. 3 rescuers emerged from the trees, moving carefully in snowshoes, red jackets bright against the white morning. Behind them came a sheriff's deputy with a medical pack, and behind him, almost stumbling with urgency, a white couple in winter coats, faces drawn with fear and hope. Emily's mother had light brown hair spilling from beneath her knit hat, her cheeks wet before she even reached the porch. Her father, tall and fair-skinned with a beard dusted in snow, kept one hand near his wife's back, as if holding himself together by helping her stand. Caleb opened the door before they arrived. She is awake, he said softly. She is cold, but responsive. Emily heard her mother's voice and sat up too quickly. Shadow rose with her, steadying himself along the cot, as if he knew she needed something solid beside her. Mom. The woman crossed the room in 3 steps and fell to her knees at the cot, gathering Emily carefully, mindful of the blankets, mindful of the pups, but unable to hold back the sound that broke from her chest. It was not loud. It was the kind of sound a heart makes when it finds what it thought it had lost. Emily's father knelt beside them, one hand on his daughter's hair, the other covering his eyes for a moment. We are here, sweetheart, he whispered. We are right here. Shadow stood beside the cot, watching the reunion with quiet dignity. No barking, no jumping, just a tired German shepherd with snow still melting along his coat. His work not yet surrendered until he was certain every soul was accounted for. Emily's mother looked at him through tears. Shadow, she breathed. The dog stepped forward, and she wrapped one arm around his neck, pressing her forehead to his fur. You brought her back. Shadow leaned into her, eyes half closed, as if he had been waiting all morning to hear those words and could finally set down a weight too large for any animal to carry, yet somehow carried anyway. The medic checked Emily with warm hands and a calm voice, then examined Finn and Grace, both wrapped like tiny bundles of breath. They need a veterinarian, he said, but they have a chance. Emily looked at Caleb then, her eyes heavy but clear. Can Shadow ride with us? Her father answered before anyone else could. Shadow rides wherever you ride. Caleb stepped back toward the stove, giving the family room, but Shadow turned and came to him. The dog pressed his muzzle against Caleb's hand. Not a command, not a request, a thank you spoken in the old language of trust. Caleb knelt, and for 1 second the cabin disappeared again, replaced by every dog he had loved, every promise he had feared he had failed, every quiet mercy that had followed him through the years without asking to be named. He rested his forehead lightly against Shadow's. You did not leave them, he whispered. Shadow's tail moved once. Outside, the rescuers prepared the sled for Emily, the sky brightening by degrees, the storm thinning into silence. And as they carried her from the cabin, wrapped warm between her parents, with Finn and Grace secured beside her and Shadow walking close enough for her hand to rest on his collar. Caleb saw the cliff above the trees glowing in a soft wash of morning gold, no longer a place of fear, but the place where a dog's love had risen louder than the storm. By the time the rescue convoy reached the lower trailhead, the storm had softened into a gentle fall of snow, the kind that no longer threatened, only blessed the world in silence. Emily rode wrapped in blankets on the rescue sled, one mittened hand resting on Shadow's collar, her fingers curled into the blue nylon, as if it were a promise she could hold. Finn and Grace were tucked in a warmed carrier beside her, their tiny bodies no longer shaking, their breath small but steady beneath folded towels. Caleb walked several yards behind with the deputy, his rope coiled over one shoulder, his field jacket dark with melted snow, his knees stiff but his eyes clear. Every few steps Shadow looked back at him, not because he needed guidance, but because loyalty always counted its people. At the trailhead, Emily's mother climbed into the ambulance with her daughter, while her father helped lift the pup carrier inside. Before the doors closed, Emily pushed herself up just enough to look past the medic. "Mr. Caleb," she called softly. Caleb stepped closer. Her face was pale, but the life had returned to her eyes. "Do you think Grace is really a good name?" Caleb looked at the tiny pup bundled beside Finn, then at Shadow standing in the snow between all of them, tired and noble and dusted in white. "I think it is the only name she could have had," he said. Emily smiled, and for a moment the morning seemed warmer. The ambulance doors closed, and the vehicle rolled slowly down the mountain road, followed by Emily's parents in the sheriff's truck. Shadow did not jump in right away. He stood beside Caleb as the engine hummed, his amber eyes following Emily until the curve of the road took her from sight. Then he sat down in the snow and leaned his shoulder against Caleb's leg. No one spoke for a few seconds. The deputy looked away, pretending to check his radio, but Caleb saw him wipe one eye with the back of his glove. The world was quiet now except for idling engines and pine branches releasing snow in soft sighs. Caleb lowered himself to one knee, ignoring the ache. Shadow turned his head toward him. Up close, the shepherd looked older than he had on the ridge. Not old in years, maybe, but old in the way loyal hearts become after carrying fear for someone they love. Caleb rubbed the fur beneath his collar and finally read the tag clearly. Shadow Hartwell. Under the name, scratched faintly from where, were 3 words. "Stay with me." Caleb's throat tightened. He knew those words. Not from the tag. From hospitals. From long roads. From every soul that had ever reached for another in the dark. "You did," Caleb whispered. "You stayed." Later that afternoon, at the small veterinary clinic in Silverton, the waiting room filled with the smell of wet coats, coffee, and antiseptic. Emily was at the county hospital for observation, safe and warming, but she had refused to rest until someone called about Shadow and the puppies. So Caleb sat on a wooden bench with the Hartwells, listening as Dr. Laura Bennett came through the swinging door with a gentle smile. Finn and Grace were weak, she said, but improving. No major injuries. They would need warmth, bottle feeding, and steady care for several weeks. Shadow, however, had worn his paws raw from moving through snow and ice, and he was deeply exhausted. He would recover. He only needed rest. Emily's mother covered her mouth, crying again, but this time the tears were different. Her father reached for Caleb's hand and shook it with both of his. "I do not know how to thank you," he said. Caleb looked through the glass window into the exam room, where Shadow lay on a thick blanket, head raised despite the medicine making his eyes heavy, still watching the door, still waiting for Emily. "Thank him," Caleb said. "I was just the man who heard him." 3 days later, the sun returned to Silverton with a brightness that made every rooftop shine. Caleb stopped by the Hartwell cabin because Emily had asked for him. She sat on the porch bundled in a quilt, a warm mug beside her, Finn and Grace sleeping in a basket at her feet. Shadow lay next to her chair with bandaged paws stretched forward, but when Caleb approached, his tail thumped once against the wood. Emily reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small. It was a copy of Shadow's old tag, newly polished, hanging from a short piece of blue cord. "Mom said you should have one," she said. Caleb took it carefully. On the front was Shadow's name. On the back were the same 3 words. "Stay with me." Caleb looked at the tag resting in his palm, and all at once the old ache he had carried for Atlas felt different. Not gone. Grief does not vanish because one good thing happens. But it had moved. It had made room for something warmer. He knelt beside Shadow, and the dog pressed his muzzle into Caleb's shoulder with quiet recognition, as if he understood that some rescues happen long after the danger has passed. Emily watched them and whispered, "Maybe Atlas sent him." Caleb closed his fingers around the tag. He had never told Emily that name. Not once. The porch went still. The trees stood silent beyond the yard. Even the pups seemed to sleep more deeply in the basket. Caleb looked at Shadow, whose amber eyes held the calm of snowfields after sunrise, and he did not try to explain it. Some things are too gentle to be solved. Some mercies arrive without footprints until you look back and see they were walking beside you the whole way. Caleb smiled through the quiet in his chest and clipped the blue cord to his key ring. Down in the valley, church bells began to ring noon across the bright winter air, soft and steady, carrying over the pines, over the road, over the cliff where a dog had once howled into a storm and refused to let love disappear. Shadow lowered his head onto Emily's boot. Finn sighed in his sleep. Grace curled closer to her brother, and Caleb sat with them in the sunlight, understanding at last that not every story ends with a loud victory. Some end with a child safe at home, two small lives breathing in a basket, a faithful dog sleeping without fear, and a broken man finally believing that Grace had not forgotten his name.